Welcome to Canyon Professional Development. Today we are going to focus on topic 4, our multi-tiered systems of support. We're going to look at the MTSS academic implementation and progress monitoring. My name is Wendy Norberg. I'm currently an instructional coach with 23 years in education. In this part, we will look at what Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 instruction and interventions look like in the classroom. You will work to develop a classroom implementation plan for interventions. Resources for this will be found in the downloadable files, and we will determine a process to ensure ongoing progress monitoring is taking place and student progress is being documented. Again, forms to do this will be made available, so we're just going to touch on it in this part. As we work through this, I want you to ask yourself, what knowledge am I gaining? What holes do I see that I still have that I need to dig deeper? And where would I like to see our campus move in the future? I want you to take a minute to read and reflect on these quotes. Share your thoughts with others or jot down your ideas if you're alone. Every student can learn, just not on the same day or in the same way. Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. This is often attributed to Einstein, however, the author is truly unknown. We're going to revisit these quotes at the end, but as we're working through them, I want you to think about them. Here we have an overview of tier instruction, what it looks like specifically in the classroom or maybe in pull-out settings. Keeping in mind that this will look different for every campus. Every campus and every classroom on the same campus, every classroom should look similar. However, MTSS will look different at each campus based on the resources that you have available. Do the best that you can with what you have, and know that MTSS is always forward motion. We're always learning more. So when we learn more, when we do better. So don't be too hard on yourself, but also be excited about where you can move with it. Tier 1 instruction involves 80 to 90% of students, whether we're talking about your classroom or your school. In Tier 1 instruction, core instruction is focused on state standards. Differentiated instruction is taking place with flexible grouping. Students aren't placed in a group and kept in that group, they move based on their needs. Skill-based interventions are introduced for a minimum of 4 weeks. Now, this would be a whole group. So, for example, say you're working on fractions in math, and you see that your whole class is struggling with one aspect of fractions, then in your classroom with your whole group, you would work on teaching that specific skill. It involves ongoing formative and summative assessments, and students in this are closely monitored using universal screening and benchmarks identified school-wide. This might be DIBELS, this might be FastBridge, whatever it is that your campus has chosen to use. You can see those students are in green. Those students are moving at a rate and a pace that we would like to see. Tier 2 students, again, for a specific skill. A student is not necessarily placed in Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 for every aspect of reading or every aspect of math, but based on the specific skill we're looking at. So Tier 2, we can see it's yellow, a little bit more cautious, a little bit warning about these students. They're 5 to 15% of our students. Tier 1 and Tier 1 instruction and interventions continue. Small group work takes place at this time. Skill-based interventions are implemented for a minimum of 4 weeks. We're going to touch on that further in a little bit. And bi-weekly progress monitoring should take place at this time. If a student in Tier 1 starts to make progress, they should be bumped back up to Tier 2 students should be bumped up to Tier 1. If, however, we see that they're not making progress at the end of 4 weeks, we would move them to Tier 3. And Tier 3 students, we can see it's red. It's getting our attention. We really need to stop. We really need to dig and do some intensive individualized work with these students. This is 1 to 5% of students. Tier 1 and 2 instruction and interventions continue. Remember, while these interventions are taking place, we don't want our students to get behind and not be receiving that Tier 1 instruction because we're working on them with a focused skill and a focused area. And so they may not be struggling with what's currently being taught in the Tier 1 setting. This should be small group or one-on-one work. Now, since it's only 1 to 5% of our students, any small group work should truly be no more than 2 to 3 students. However, I realize that's in a perfect world, so do the best that you can with what you have. Skill-based interventions below and at grade level are taking place at this time for a minimum of 4 weeks. Again, remember that interventions are not watered down curriculum. We're going to touch on that in a little bit. However, their students may be having some gaps, and maybe there's skills that we need to go back and reteach in order to teach the current grade level standards and skills. Key players in each tier. Key players must have a solid understanding of what each tier of intervention looks like and how to document interventions being used. Tier 1 typically, not always, but typically is the classroom teacher and paraprofessionals. It's our whole group instruction. Tier 2, if these resources are available on your campus, are your classroom teacher, your paraprofessionals, and your instructional specialists. This might also be your speech teacher. And these are small groups. Small groups can take place in your setting. They can be taking place outside of your setting, outside of your classroom. Now, keep in mind, we talked about being flexible. Say, for example, you are not able to have an instructional specialist due to resources on your campus. You might choose to have a teacher trained on your grade level in a specific intervention program to use for Tier 2 and students. So then those students might be pulled out and go to another teacher's classroom for a little bit for those Tier 2 interventions. Tier 3 is a team approach. The classroom teacher, paraprofessionals, and instructional specialists are involved in this individualized instruction. Remember, if it's small group, it's probably no more than 2 or 3 students. Notice that the classroom teacher is bold in every single one of these tiers. The classroom teacher is responsible for instruction in every single one of these tiers. Just because a student is pulled out with an instructional specialist does not mean that the classroom teacher is no longer responsible for Tier 1 and Tier 2 instruction. Let's review quickly and briefly what an intervention must be. It should involve well-planned instruction for all students, target an identified area of need. It continues instruction. It does not replace instruction. It should be provided and documented consistently over an identified time span, which we'll touch on a little bit further. An intervention is not watering down the curriculum. It's not sending the student away for others to work with. And it's not extra work or additional practice. It's not punitive. It's not meant to retain or suspend students either. And it is not for only struggling students. Remember, interventions involve well-planned instruction for all students. We'll see that in our Tier 1 interventions. Let's look at some Tier 1 ELA interventions. A phonics instruction program might have been adopted by your campus. Some popular ones for K2 are Haggerty, Foundations in Spalding, or for K6. There's a list of resources available for download within these topics, so go ahead and feel free to check those out. Your campus might have adopted a reading program, ReadyGen, Harcourt. At this time, instruction is focused on the core standards. You would have a lot of whole group instruction at this time. You might use advanced organizers or thinking maps to instruct at this time. Differentiated instructions taking place. Many visuals, modeling, keeping in mind the different ways that our students learn. Our kinesthetic learners, do we have movement? Are we including brain breaks in our day? All of these are Tier 1 interventions. One thing that I always like to emphasize is Tier 1 interventions should always include enrichment and challenge activities. Remember, these are interventions for all students. Tier 2 interventions, Tier 1 interventions continue. Phonics targeted intervention lessons are taking place. Haggerty has some fantastic intervention lessons. Do you have a program like Haggerty? If not, think about talking to your campus administrators or finding a way, if you are the campus administrator, to find some of these resources. Perhaps you might want to use the Sunday system. Again, I'm not recommending these programs. I'm simply saying that there are many resources available. In the past, I've seen some campuses where I mentioned that if you don't have an instructional specialist, they might choose one teacher per grade level to train in the Sunday system, and then that teacher becomes a small group instructor for Tier 2 instruction. Think outside of the box. How can you make this work for your campus? There's not one fit plan for every campus. Reading fluency programs. 6-Minute Solution is a fantastic reading fluency program that can be used for Tier 1 and Tier 2 instruction and interventions. Scaffolding activities should take place at this time. Are the instructors helping the students to make connections between previous learning and current learning? Front loading is also fantastic, where you introduce the students to a topic before they learn it in the whole group setting. Skills-based interventions, small group instruction, specialized vocabulary instruction. We know that vocabulary is often the greatest indicator of reading success. Are these students knowledgeable about the vocabulary they need to know to be successful? If not, these should be included in the lessons that are being developed for our intervention time. Specialized comprehension strategies, such as making inferences, beginning, middle, and end. Questioning. The closed technique is fantastic at this time, where students might choose to circle words they don't know, underline the main idea. They might also choose to write thoughts, questions, comments, and ideas that they have in the margins. We really want to dig deeper to see what our students are thinking during this reading time. Tier 3 interventions. Tier 1 and Tier 2 instruction continues. Phonics intervention lessons are taking place. Reading program intervention lessons are taking place. If your campus has adopted a reading program such as ReadyGen or Harcourt, something along those lines, there is typically supplemental resources that provide you with reading program intervention lessons. Dig deeper and see if your campus has those available. If not, this might be something you need to think about purchasing. Students in Tier 3 should be visualizing and verbalizing a great deal. Do you have access to an Orton Gillingham multisensory program? Students in Tier 3 should be working to develop metacognitive skills, their thinking skills. What are they thinking? How are they thinking? Model for the students. What are you thinking as you read? One-on-one instruction takes place during this time. And if there is small group instruction, it's typically just 2 to 3 students that are involved. Remember, there's only 1 to 5% of students that are receiving these Tier 3 interventions. And a great deal of positive reinforcement. Remember, interventions and intervention time is not punitive, nor should it be viewed as such. Ideally, if a student, as we mentioned, is receiving Tier 3 services, they would bump back up to Tier 2 and Tier 1 with successful interventions. Let's look briefly at math Tier 1 interventions. At this time, students are receiving whole group instruction, focusing on the state standards. There might be some small group instruction, differentiated instruction, visuals, modeling, enrichment, and challenge activities. In math especially, we want to make sure that our students are developing number sense. So what skills can we work on in our Tier 1 intervention time, in our Tier 1 instruction time, that benefits all students, because all students are receiving this instruction. Tier 2, math intervention. Tier 1 instruction continues. One-on-one instruction that is systematic and explicit. Small group instruction. Specialized vocabulary instruction. Skill-based interventions. Math fact skills and strategies interventions. Vocabulary is just important in math as it is in ELA. Students need to understand the word problems that they're reading. They also need to understand if they're asking for, say for example, they're studying numbers in the younger grades, and they might need to know the difference between a numeral and a digit. What is being asked when they ask for a digit? What is the digit in the tens place? In the older grades, equivalent and unequivalent. What do those words mean and what is being looked for? Oftentimes, just understanding the math vocabulary, which is a language in and of itself, is a great Tier 2 intervention. That can be done through language games, other resources as well. Math Tier 3 interventions. Tier 1 and 2 instruction and interventions continue. One-on-one instruction takes place that is intensive, systematic, and multi-sensory. Small group instruction, again, it might be 2 to 3 students. Cumulative review and continual instruction. Remember, these interventions are not replacing what is being taught in Tier 1, but rather they are adding on to it. And it might be going back and reviewing skills that have been missed. And positive reinforcement. Now let's talk about what the interventions look like when they're implemented into the classroom. Step 1, the classroom teacher must take a baseline. We need to know where the students are at, what skill deficits they might have, what skill strengths they might have. Because remember, interventions include enrichments as well. Step 2 is to provide an intervention on specific skill for a minimum of 4 weeks. Now you notice I put great emphasis on this. Oftentimes, classroom teachers, reading specialists, even administrators will say, we tried it for a little bit, but 2 or 3 days of trying an intervention is not enough to know if it was successful. The students must have that minimum of 4 weeks. At times, we've even said 4 to 6 weeks. That skill must be taught with fidelity throughout that 4 weeks. Step 3, change intervention if needed throughout 4 weeks. So, we stated that you want to use the intervention for 4 weeks. You are focusing on that skill. You really want to try to stick with that intervention for 4 weeks, but if it is absolutely not working, you might need to change it. However, it's highly recommended that you do that very cautiously. Step 4, take a post-intervention score after a minimum of 4 weeks of focusing on the specific skill. Step 5, if the post-intervention score shows growth of targeted skill, keep going. It is working. So your students may not have it mastered, but they're making progress, which is what we hope to see. If post-intervention score does not show growth of targeted skill, discuss with your MTSS team. The student might need to go further. They might need to move from Tier 1 to Tier 2 to Tier 3. However, you can see that it should be fluid. They could go between the tiers. Where have we been? We have identified our understanding of the tiers. We have defined academic interventions. We have identified some academic interventions. Again, the list provided is barely scratching the surface. Once you become more confident, you can dig for further interventions to put in place, keeping in mind that they should always be research-based. We want to make sure that the interventions that we're using are research-based and evidence has shown them to be successful. We've outlined the process of implementing interventions, and we've discussed how to document interventions. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. Documenting interventions, we want to make sure that we include the student name, the person responsible for intervention implementation, the identified area of concern, the target goal. It should always be aligned with the grade level priority standard. The date, time, and location of the interventions that took place, the current tier the student is on, the intervention being used, and the intervention effectiveness rating. Documentation is essential to ensure research-based interventions are being used consistently. So I cannot emphasize enough, going back here, that the process of implementing the interventions should take place for a minimum of 4 weeks. On our form, this is where we would note if we changed our interventions. Now, when I was talking about step 2, I said that we wanted to make sure that we stuck with an intervention. Our form where we're documenting this will show us if we're switching intervention tactics and skills and strategies every 2 to 3 days, that shows us that we're probably not trying them with fidelity and we are probably not implementing them and giving them time to make a difference. So that documentation form will help us out a great deal to see if we're sticking with it or if we're moving too quickly. Intervention action steps. You should outline your intervention implementation process for classrooms to add to your MTSS handbook. In doing so, think about how long will you require interventions to be used prior to moving a student to another tier or under discussing in MTSS. How will this be communicated to the staff? You should create an intervention list overview plan or template to add to your MTSS handbook. Documents are provided in the appendix. You should create an intervention tracking form to add to your MTSS handbook. You can use the provided information documents in the attached appendix. Reflecting on these after we've spoken in detail about classroom interventions, has your thinking changed? Every student can learn, just not on the same day or in the same way. I think the value of interventions really starts to be seen when we understand that our students cannot learn the same way in the same day. We've just touched on academic interventions, and in our next topic, we will talk about social and emotional learning interventions. We need to think about the whole child. What does their day look like? What interventions might they need? That goes back to, do we change our intervention or do we keep our intervention? What would be best for our students? Everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. Are we asking a student that learns better through kinesthetic modalities to learn just auditory? Are we asking visual students to learn just through auditory means? What are we doing in our intervention times and in our instructional times to help our students to find success? If you're feeling overwhelmed, stop and ask yourself, if you're a leader, can you identify teacher leaders on your campus who can or do successfully implement intervention strategies? Place teachers successfully using interventions or willing to try interventions in PLCs with those more resistant. Maybe your PLCs aren't just by grade level. Maybe you're mixing them up by intervention strategies. You might want to choose one or two intervention strategies for each tier to teachers to implement consistently. You might ask for documentation for one student. Remember, 1 to 5% of all students are in tier 3, so you might possibly ask the teachers to choose one student that's identified as tier 3 in ELA in their classroom, one that's identified in math, choose an intervention, and document that. Create a need list document. Create a shared document campus-wide that allows all involved to brainstorm tier intervention forms and plans. If you're asking your teachers to use, or you're being asked as a teacher to use tier 2 and tier 3 interventions, do you have the resources you need to do that? If not, where can you find them? What is your takeaway? What do you feel confident with? What do you feel you need to learn more about? Additional course handouts can be found. The 3-tiered instructional model can be found, and you can download that. ELA Tier 1, 2, 3 Classroom Intervention Overview and Plan Template. An example document can be found. A classroom intervention tracking form for math and ELA can be found as well. Feel free to subscribe for more PD at this channel. And if you would like to dig a little bit deeper for customized professional development, please contact us at. I've enjoyed being here with you today. I hope that this helps you to dig a little bit deeper, knowing that we are just scratching the surface, but that's where we would like to start. And remember, when we learn more, we do more. And when we learn better ways of doing them, we always continue to improve. Thank you for the time you've spent with me today.